There we go. All right, so we're going to get started. Like I said before, if you keep your phones on mute, that'd be great. If you have any questions, just obviously turn the mute button off and ask. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to do the sugya of the Seudas Mafsekes, the one we have on Erev Tisha B'Av. Because first of all, it's a nice small Gemara, and the Gemara is a very it's a really good Svara Gemara because it shows you that when it comes to constructing, especially the Rabbanans, you kind of get a sense of how it evolves. So today we'll spend time on the halachic construct of the Seudah, and maybe full time we'll start as well the surah the precedent for the Seudah, and then the next week we'll take care of the actual the Seudah itself. In other words, the Tafshilin. And just to keep one thing in mind, it's very important when you approach these sugyas to erase what you normally do. Obviously, this year is a little different because the traditional Seudah Mafsekes of what the Minhag Ashkenaz of having eggs, which we'll take up next week. So we don't really do that much today because it's going to be Shabbos. But in general, we think of. I'm obviously projecting, but when you think of Seudah Mafsekes and Erev Tisha B'Av, so most people think of eggs and ashes and these other symbols. But as you'll see, in reality, that's something that came up later on. Actually, I shouldn't say that; it was early, but we'll see from the Rambam and other sources how it got to that point. So the first thing we'll start off with is the Mishnah. All right, so it's a very, very long Mishnah, but for the guys who have the source sheets themselves, I just quoted the line that's important. So the Mishnah says, it says on Erev Tisha B'Av, so the Mishnah says, Lo yochal adam shnei tafshilin, lo yochal basar v'lo yishteh yain. All right, so on Erev Tisha B'Av, the Mishnah says a person should not eat two cooked foods. Okay. Rashi on two cooked foods actually cites for the guys who were in my shir last year, they should remember this, but he cites the Gemara in Pesachim. So he says shnei tafshilin is basar v'dagim, o basar beitzim she'alav, o dagu beitza she'alav, kedamar parak arbe pesachim. So we know that there's halacha on the Seder night to bring out on the ka'ara to bring out shnei tafshilin. So Rashi says the source for the precedent for shnei tafshilin, or I should say what they turn to construct shnei tafshilin, is going to be found in what they use for Seder night. So we'll take that up probably next week. So immediately in Erev Tisha B'Av, you see there's a restriction. The person he shouldn't eat two cooked foods. Okay, and then it says lo yochal basar v'lo yishteh yain. You shouldn't eat meat or drink wine. And then Rabban Gamliel says, Rav Shimon Gamliel says yishaneh. So you should make a change, right? Don't ask what that is yet. Rashi says Gemara Farish. There's some sort of change that Rav Shimon Gamliel is saying you're gonna have to do, and we may take that up at the end of today. We'll see how things go time wise. Okay, so take a look at the Gemara. So the Gemara is Laman Amud Aleph. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says Amar Yehuda. Okay, Lo Shanu. Okay, so you get now. This is a very on the surface. This is a very tricky area to approach. You have to be very careful. We have to be very careful when you approach this Gemara. Very, very careful. And you'll see why in a second. So the Gemara says, Amar Yehuda, Lo Shanu Ella Mishesh Sha'os Ulamala. Okay? So what do you mean Lo Shanu? So the restriction of eating two tafshilin, okay, we'll stick to two tafshilin for now. The restriction of not eating two tafshilin, that restriction only applies from 6 hours and above. So from Chatzos and beyond on Erev Tisha B'Av, that's when the restriction of what you're allowed to eat takes place. Okay? Aval mishesho sulumata mutter. But if he eats, if he's eating before chatzos, okay, so then the restrictions of shnei tafshilin, that restriction does not apply. Okay, so again, in Rabbi Yehuda's first principle, he's saying that when does the restriction apply? It applies from chatzos and beyond on Erev Tisha B'Av. Okay. I assume there's no, at this point, that should be clear. Okay, V'amar Rabbi Yehuda, now comes a second principle. Lo shanu ella b'seudah hamafsek ba. So Rabbi Yehuda says, the restrictions only apply to the seudah that you're masik ba. What's a seudah that you're masik ba? Okay, so Rashi says, Deshuv eino ochal od me'osa seudah ve'elach. So Suda Mafsekes means that I am. It's basically the last meal. In other words, I'm eating this meal, and I will not eat past this point. Okay. Aval b'Seuda she'eno mafsek ba mutter. Okay. But by a Suda that you're not mafsek ba, so then it will be mutter. So what's mutter? Meaning that it'd be mutter to have whatever you want. You're not limited by the restrictions of the Suda Mafsekes. Okay. So Rav Yehuda has two principles. Okay, two principles. Principle number one is that when do these restrictions apply? Okay, they apply from 6 hours and beyond. In other words, from Chatzos until Shkia. That's the first set of restrictions. Okay, excuse me, the first principle of restrictions. So you can't have a meal with two tafshilin. Let's make a simple case from noon until 6 p.m. and that time zone. You can't have a meal with two tafshilin. But if you ate before chatzos, you could. And the second principle is that these restrictions only apply by the Suda Hamasik Ba. About the Suda Sheina Masik Ba Mutter. Okay? So this is very, very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. Because you have two principles that, as you'll see, that don't really work well together naturally. And the Gemara, I think, as we work out the Svara, the Gemara is going to show us where at first glance it appears that these principles are dissonant or they're not able to function together. In reality, there's a way to work out that they really do work seamlessly. So let's go a little more on the Gemara, and then we'll set up the questions, then we'll work on some Svaras. So the Gemara says, okay, and then the Gemara says, Travaya Lakula. Okay, so in both situations we're Mako, okay? And Utsricha, and we need both. Why? So let's say you just had the principle that when do the restrictions apply? By Suda Hamasik Ba. So Havamina, that's what I love about this Gemara, just like spelling out for you how to define it. So Havamina Afilu Mishesha Sulamata. So what would you think? If you just said Suda Mafsek Ba, so you would think that if I ate my Suda Hamafseket, let's say at 9 o'clock in the morning, right, I would have to eat it with, I won't be able to have two tafshilin. The restrictions would still apply. So Kamash Malan, Mishesho Sulamala. Okay, so again, the Gemara is trying to join together the two principles. The Gemara is trying to take these two principles and unite them. So the Gemara is saying that if you just had Suda Mafsek Ba, so you would think that you can't, that from a restriction standpoint, I can't have Shnei Tafshilin whenever I have my Suda Mafsekes. So I could be having my Suda Mafsekes at 9 o'clock in the morning, I can't have two Tafshilin. So the Chiddush is that no, the restriction of two Tafshilin only applies from Chatzos and beyond. Okay? You don't need to announce yourself, Avi, but just put your phone on mute though, okay? Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, so again, so the Gemara first says that the Gemara's answer is to say that why do you need a Suda Mafsek Ba? Because you would why do you need Sheshos? Because you would think that the restrictions of Suda Mafsek Ba really apply the entire day, or even before Chatzos. Kamash Malan, that the restrictions only apply after Chatzos. So before you go to the next uniting of principles, there's one important point you see, halachically speaking, there's one important concept that you can derive from this Gemara. So what's that concept? Anyone take a shot at that? Just simple idea. Simple halakha reality. What do you see? Anyone? Question is that the Gemara is telling you that if you only had Suda Mafsek Ba, so what would you think? You would think that before Chatzos, right, the restrictions of Shnei Tafshilin apply. And so too after Chatzos they apply. Right? Meaning anytime I have a Suda Mafsekes, the restrictions apply. Kamash Malan, that the restrictions of the Suda Mafsekes, meaning my limitation where I can only have one Tafshil, only kicks in after Chatzos. So therefore what? What do you see from that Maskana? It's an important idea. No one would do this, but it's an important halacha conclusion. So forget the second part of what you said. Okay, don't worry about that. We'll get that in a second. Whatever you want, but correct. You could have. Oh, I know what you mean. You mean in the Suda, right? Avi's right. In other words, the implication for the Gemara is that if I have my Suda Mafsekes at 9 o'clock in the morning, right, I can have a huge buffet meal. I have the das. I'm not going to eat again, and I have my Suda Mafsekes, right? So there's no. So the Gemara is it's an important point. In other words, if you had a Suda Mafsekes in the morning, right? You'd be allowed to have whatever you want, as long as your intention is not to eat for the rest of the day. Okay? So that's like an interesting consequence of this position. Okay? Now the Gemara says, now comes the other side. Okay, the Gemara says, so let's say you just had the idea that from chatzos and beyond, you can't, the restrictions apply. Okay? But you didn't have Seuda Mafsek ba. So Havamina afilu besuda she'eno Mafsek ba. So then what would you think? You would think that, let's say I decide to have 2 meals after chatzos, right? So every one of those meals, the restrictions would apply, right? Every one of those meals, the restrictions would apply. So kamash v'lan besuda ha-Mafsek ba. So it's only in the Seuda that I'm actually Mafsek ba, in that time zone, meaning from chatzos and beyond, that's the only time when the restrictions apply. Okay, so if I decide to have multiple meals after chatzos, right, I'm allowed to eat whatever I want. Let's put aside basar and yayin. I can have whatever I want, tafshil wise. I can have 1,000,000 cooked dishes. But whenever I choose to have my Seuda Mafsek ba, at that point in time, right, then the restrictions would apply. Okay? So let me just repeat it one more time, and then we'll start defining this. So again, the Gemara has 2 principles. Okay, principle 1, that from 6 hours and on, the restrictions of Shnei Tafshilin apply. Principle number 2, that the restrictions only apply by Seuda Mafsek ba. Now the Gemara has to unite those principles, and to unite them, the Gemara says, okay, if you only had Seuda Mafsek ba, right, so then you would think that even that the entire day, right, anytime I had my Seuda Mafsekes, the restrictions would apply. Kamash v'lan, the restrictions only apply from chatzos and beyond. And then the second thing the Gemara says, if I only had sheishos l'mala, right, then I would think that any meal I have after chatzos, the restrictions would apply. So kamash v'lan, it's only the Seuda Mafsek ba that the restrictions apply. Okay? I want to make sure that's perfectly clear for everybody before we go on. Any questions? Is that clear factually? I'm not hiding anything. There are no missing facts here. Everything's out in the open. Okay? You don't need to apologize. Again, in other words, what the Gemara is saying is that there's 2 principles. Principle one is that when the restrictions of your Seuda, they kick in from chatzos and beyond. So let's say from 12 noon, to make up a day, it's 6 to 6 and 12 to the middle. So from 12 noon until 6 p.m., anytime from 12 noon to 6 p.m., so then the restrictions of Shnei Tafshilin apply, meaning I can only have 1 cooked dish in my Seuda. And then the second idea is that when the restrictions apply, they only apply, the restriction of 1 tafshil only applies by the Seuda ha-Mafsek ba. Okay? But the Gemara can't leave these 2 principles as being separate, so the Gemara needs to unite them. So the Gemara says, okay, well, to unite them, the Gemara is going to say, okay, if you only had, let's say you only had Seuda Mafsek ba, that principle. So then what you would think is that it applies no matter when I have my Seuda Mafsekes, right? So Kamash V'lan, Sheishos Mala teaches you that when I have my Seuda Mafsekes, after Chatzos, then the restrictions kick in. And the other way is that if I only had Sheishos Mala, if I only knew the principle that the restrictions apply from 12 p.m. and beyond, then I would think that every single time I have a meal, right, I can only have 1 tafshil. Right? So Kamash V'lan, Seuda Mafsek ba comes to tell you that the restriction of 1 tafshil only applies in the case of Seuda Mafsek ba. So if I eat, I can have 17,000 meals from 12 p.m. until Shkia, but the last one, or the one that I'm Mafsek ba, that's the one where the restriction of 1 tafshil would apply. Okay? Is that clear? I'm sorry, one at a time. That's okay. So you're asking a deep, or you're asking a different question. Like in other words, Rashi says, we'll get to Seuda Mafsekes in a second, a little deeper. But Rashi, just take Rashi right now. He says, what's a Mafsek ba? Deshuv eina ochel od me'osa Seuda ve'elach. So when a guy says to himself, I will not eat past this point, right? So theoretically speaking, the Seuda Mafsek ba, what you're saying is that, practically speaking, you could argue that what's Seuda Mafsek ba? You could say until the Isser of Achila kicks in. But what we really hold, you'll see in a second, what we really hold is a das idea. Like a guy sits down and says, this is my last meal. Okay? And by the way, I mean, this isn't the first instance of Seuda Mafsek ba. We're all aware that the classic case of Seuda Mafsekes Erev Yom Kippur. It's a mitzvah, right? It's a mitzvah. It's the anti-tashvisu. You should go in with the anti-tashvisu type of thinking. All right. So okay. So other than that, but I'll speed up. When we do the Ramban, you'll see that the Ramban brings out what you're sensing in a second. But before we get to the Ramban, I want to make sure, is everything, factually clear up to this point? Just facts. Okay. No questions? Okay. But now let's ask some questions, okay? Well, obviously what we have to define here is we're going to have to go in order of Havin Maskana. In other words, the Gemara says, the Gemara, you see the Gemara is nervous. It senses a problem here with these two principles because they're not naturally attracted to each other, almost in like a chemical way. Because the first one's an idea in the Seudah itself, and the second one is an idea in Sheishos Lamala. And those two things have nothing to do with each other. So the Gemara has to fight to unite, to bring them together. So what I'm going to show you is that is when we define this, we have to sense what's really bothering the Gemara and bring that out. And you'll see there's like one svara that kind of drives this whole sugya, and really, in my opinion, brings out the beauty of this specific idea of the Seudah. Okay, the first step to do this, I think, is to do that the Ran. I think it's at source number 3 that I on the source sheet. All right, but he says he quotes the Ramban, and the Ramban's a very important Ramban because he says something. I think Tzvi David was bothered by this. But what the Ramban's going to say is really the starting point, in my opinion, for how to define this. So what does he say? So the Ran says, he quotes the Ramban, Kosav Ramban. He says, Mistavra, right, Diseuda ha-mafsekba. So what is the Seudah mafsekba? What does that mean? It says, Kol she'eno osid lisod Seudah acheres shel kvias. Okay? Afapi shedaito le'achol aray. Okay? So he says, what's Seudah mafsekba? So it means that my intention is not to have another Seudah of Kviyas. Okay? So I don't want to get too much into this yet, but let's just say for now, that means like a Seudah with Lechem, right? But that doesn't mean, what do you call it? Doesn't include Achilas Arai. It's like I must have an apple afterwards. Okay? And we'll get to Halacha L'Maisa next week, how that works. But anyway, what it means right now is a guy sitting down saying, this is my last meal. Okay, it's not my last Maisa Achila, it's my last meal. Okay? And then he says it's not like those people who what they do is they fill up with basar and yayin, and then they eat like a little arai to be mafsek and achila. Okay? So meaning that it's not the achilas arai. In other words, his point that he's bringing out is that it's not the achilas arai. It's not like what you were saying, Tzvi David. It's not the last Maisa Achila that defines it as Seudah mafsekba. Seudah mafsekba means that I sit down and I'm koveya a seudah that is my last meal of this time. You know what I mean? It's not that a guy says, you mean why should you have such a phenomenon? Okay, so hold on. That's a good question. That's a good question. We'll take that up probably a little more next week, okay? We'll get to more into how it works. But for now, there's one point I want to get out from the Ramban, which I think is the starting point from the Gemara, which is you have to have some concept of what Seudah mafsekba means, right? Just at a basic level, okay? Forget why it should be the case. We'll deal with that. But for now, you have to have some basic concept of what a Seudah mafsekes is. So if I asked you, yeah. Where do you get that from? Right, but it has to be a meal. By the way, no. You're jumping way ahead. You're jumping way ahead. Way ahead. No. Let me ask you a question. You oh man, you botched that, buddy. Let me ask you a question, okay? Take a look at the Ramban. Does Ramban mention anything at all about a restriction? Yeah. No. Well, say it. What's he doing? He's defining. Right. Not this. This is going to be the key to opening up the area. Okay. He never said that you have to have a Seudah mafsekba means it has restrictions in it. He's saying there's a universal idea called Seuda HaMafsekba. And what is the Seuda HaMafsekba? The last meal I have before this Taanis. What the Ramban's saying here is equally applicable to Erev Yom Kippur. There's no difference. There's no difference, right? He's saying there's not. I mean, but Erev Yom Kippur is more of a mitzvah idea. But I'm saying as a concept, Seuda Mafsekba means the last meal I have before this Taanis. That's it. No, forget the restrictions. There's no idea of restrictions. We don't know that yet. Where are you getting that from? Maybe. I don't know. Could be. Right. So you're cheating. You're cheating ahead. Take a look at the Rambam. Take a look at the Rambam. The Rambam's going to say a similar thing. I know what you're trying to do. Just you're trying to. I don't think I'm rusty at this. You're trying to back me up already, put me in a corner. But I know you got to wait. What you're saying, you're looking at it from the end point backwards, right? But you got to watch how this evolves. You got to see how this evolves. Right now, all we have is an idea of a Seuda Mafsekba. Take a look at the Rambam. The Rambam's a little bit jumbled, which we'll define also. But the Rambam seems to also have his starting point as well. The Rambam in Hilchos Taanis, he says Parakei Halacha Zayin. He says Tisha B'Av Leilo Kiyama L'Chol Davar. Okay, it's a very funny halacha because he says Tisha B'Av, the nighttime. Now, what does he mean by night? He means once it begins after Shkia, right? The restrictions of the Taanis, right, of Tisha B'Av apply at night just like they do in the day. In other words, even though it's really D'Rabbanan and most Taanis D'Rabbanan really start at Alos, right? This one's different. This one is Leilo Kiyama. It says Ve'ein ochlin elo mibod yom, right? And you can only eat during the day. There's erev. You can't wake up early before Alos. You can only eat erev Tisha B'Av. Ubein hashmasho shelo aser kiyam kippur. Okay. Now he says. Now listen. Look at his lashon. Okay. V'lo yochal basar, v'lo yishte yayin bis seuda hamafsekba. Okay. What does that mean? What's he saying? What's he saying? What's he saying? Right, okay, so what comes first? Conceptually. The Seuda Mafsekba is an idea that exists, right? And then Chazal come along and they apply a certain restriction in it. Right? But a Seuda Mafsekba is a Seuda Mafsekba. You understand? This is going to be the key to opening up this whole sugya. You can't approach this as thinking that there's a different idea of a Seuda Mafsekes in Erev Tisha B'Av. It's not. There's a universal notion of Seuda Mafsekba. Okay? And then you'll see that's exactly what's going to bother the Gemara. There's a universal idea of Seuda Mafsekba. It's just that there's certain restrictions that apply. And if you go on in the Rambam, and I'll prove it to you, because the Rambam says, if you skip ahead to, at the end he says, V'lo yochal shtei tafshil. And then it says, in Halacha Ches, he says, B'med dvarim murim, she'achal erev Tisha B'Av achar chatzos, aval im sa'ad kodem chatzos, okay, af al pi shehu mafsekba, ochol kol masha yirtzeh. Meaning what? There's a reality to a Seuda Mafsekes even before chatzos. Because a Seuda Mafsekes just means one thing. I say, this is my last kavua meal of the day. When you make that statement, right, that's a Seuda Mafsekes. So if it's before chatzos, you can have whatever you want. Right? So you'll see this. Yeah. Oh, okay, just wait. That's going to be the punchline. Just wait. You'll see. I think you're going to have to say that. Okay? I think you have to say that. But I got to prove to you the reason why. Okay? So I think. Okay. So before we start diving in, I'll see what you guys think about how to define this. Up to this point, I just want to make this. To me, it's more of an I call it like an assistance. But to me, the starting point is to understand that we're dealing with a universal notion of a Seuda Mafsekba, right? And then there's this restriction of Shnei Tafshilin. Okay? It's not that they created it's not that there's a new concept of a Seuda Mafsekes. It's not that the Seuda Mafsekes is defined as one that has the restrictions. Because if that were the case, then before Chatzos, you could never have a Seuda Mafsekes. But the Rambam seems to definitely imply, and I don't think the Ramban would disagree with this, that the idea of a Seuda Mafsekes can exist prior to Chatzos without the restrictions of Shnei Tafshilin. Okay? Okay. So if that's the case, and now, how do we define the Gemara? Anyone take a stab at it? Yeah. And what's the first? There's a Havina and there's Maskana, and there's another Havina and a Maskana. And I want to posit that the Havina Maskana, it's set up so brilliantly that the Gemara does a Havina Maskana, and the first Maskana sets up a trap for itself, and then which leads to the next Havina, and then the final Maskana resolves all the issues. It's actually, instead of looking at it as two separate Havina Maskanas, the Gemara, and it's proving my initial hypothesis, the Gemara is going to show you that these two principles are they're really united, but you have to understand the nature of the relationship between the two. Fine. But there's a problem with that though, because fine. I wouldn't even treat that as a real havmina, but I'll give you that because you're going to say but you're proving my point. The Gemara now says there's two separate pathways to accomplish this objective, right? Either a Seudas Mafsekes, right, or 6 hours and beyond. But the Gemara's not satisfied with that because then what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that they both can't be a Seudas Mafsekes, right? In other words, what are you going to say? You're going to tell me that 6 hours and beyond, I have to have a restriction insofar as any time I eat, I can only have one tavshil. And then before chatzos, I can only have one tavshil if I have a Seudas Mafsekes. You know what I mean? They don't work together. The Gemara wants them to work together. All right? So look at... Yeah. Well, hold on. I was going to say, so let's go in order. Let's just go in order, okay? Let's start with the first Havmina. The first Havmina is very simple. The first Havmina is what? The Gemara says, if you only had Seudas Mafsekes, so let's say that we only had that principle. This is the way you need to approach this, okay? Let's say I just had the principle of Seudas Mafsekes, right? So what would I think? So I would think that any time, right, I have my Seudah, right, Mafsekes, it doesn't matter what time of the day it is, right? If it's my last meal, that's my Seudas Mafsekes, right? And the Havmina is what I told you beforehand is what the Ramban and the Rambam saying. That is the idea of the Havmina. The Havmina is saying that if you just had the principle of Seudas Mafsekes, so Seudas Mafsekes means one thing. It means the last meal I have before the Taanis, right? So then if you're going to apply the other principle of restriction, right, the restriction would have to kick in anytime I have my Seudas Mafsekes. In other words, the modifier of restriction would kick in as soon as my das is to have a Seudas Mafsekes. Okay? What's the maskana of this? That's what I want to define first. What's the maskana? The Gemara says no. What do you see? You see that by having the principle of sheishos lamala, right? So now I know that the restrictions only kick in from chatzos and beyond. So what's that telling you? A change in this mind. Okay, so how? No, go ahead. Yeah. Okay, good. Right. Okay. So I would say a little differently. Okay, but I hear where you're going. I would say a little differently. But before I do that, when you say the Zman is different, what are you really saying? I mean, we have to take a step. Let's take a step back for a second, and you have to look at the construct. Let's be Ashkenazim for a second. Look at the construct of Tisha B'av. Tisha B'av, the Tisha B'av is like is the inverse of Avelis. Okay, it's inverted Zman wise. Because let's take normative Avelis. So what happens by Avelis, right? So the first day of Avelis is considered the most severe, right? Deraisa, most restrictions apply, etc. Right? Then what happens? Then the first 3 days sort of have their own structure, right? And then after the third day, there's a couple more leniencies kick in until the end of Shiva. And then after Shiva, you enter into Shloshim. And then let's say it's your parents, you have Yud Beis. So you have this slow the slow procession of leaving. Whereas when you start Avelis, you go from severe to less until finally you exit Avelis. We know Tisha B'Av is the opposite. Right? What happens by Tisha B'Av? So let's say for Ashkenazim, you start off with the 3 weeks, right? Then you move into the 9 days, right? And then from the 9 days, there's one more step that Chazal introduced, which is that's the 9 days. So Shavuot Shechaba, okay? But there's one more Zman. Sheishos, right? They're saying there's one more Zman of Veilus we're going to introduce. One more Zman where now a person's going to be even more engaged in Avelis, right? And that's the Zman from Chatzos and beyond. Okay? So what they're saying is that and this is where the modifying part is, okay? So I think the idea is like this. In other words, when it comes to the Seudah Mafsekes is Seudah Mafsekes whether or not I have Shnei Tavshilin or one Tavshil. It's irrelevant. It's always Seudah Mafsekes. But the restrictions that make up this Seudah Mafsekes, that come to now modify the Seudah Mafsekes, come from Avelis, right? And it's only from the Zman of Avelis, there's Chazal created this time of Chatzos and beyond. They said there's going to be a more severe form of Avelis, right? In that period, that Zman now lends itself to creating these restrictions. So the restrictions emerge not from the Seudah. They don't come from the Seudah, they come from the Zman. Meaning like this: I can have a Seudah Mafsekes anytime I want to. But if I have my Seudah Mafsekes during the Zman of Avelis, the Avelis is expressed in the restriction of Tavshilin. You understand? That's the way Chazal are first approaching it. Yeah. Exactly. That's the trap the Gemara set itself up in, because now you got a problem. If you're going to tell me that Chazal came along and they created a Zman Shel Avelis, but that would mean that any time I have a Seudah during that Zman, what must happen? Restrictions. In other words, if you tell me it's a product of the Zman, then any time I have a Seudah from Chatzos and beyond, those restrictions must apply. And we know that can't be. Right? See, that's why this Gemara is so amazing. In other words, think about the logical order of the Gemara. The Gemara first posits that, well, Seudah Mafsek means the last meal I have. That can happen at any period of time. The Gemara says, no. We have another idea. We have an idea where we're going to say that there's a Zman Shel Avelis. And in the Zman Shel Avelis, right, that the restrictions of Shnei Tavshilin, meaning only can have one Tavshil, they emerge from that Zman Shel Avelis. That's what it comes from. But then the Gemara says, if that's the case, now swing to the next Havamina. If that's the case, you got a big problem. Because any time I have a Seudah from Chatzos and beyond, the restriction should kick in. Because it's a din in the Zman. The Zman, that, in other words, being from 12 p.m. until 6 p.m. In that period of time, I am in super Avelis mode. And how is that expressed? It's expressed that when I have a Seudah, it's a restricted Seudah. Right? It's a Seudah where I can't have as many Tavshilin. It's not as happy of a Seudah. Right? But we know that can't be. Right? So the Gemara is going to have to modify that. But I want to make sure you understand the flow here. It's an unbelievable Gemara. The Gemara is showing you that it wants to maintain the independence of the conceptual Seudah Mafsekes, but you're going to have a problem because you're going to have a problem when you're facing this idea of a Zman Shel Avelis. Because in a Zman Shel Avelis, any Seudah I have, by definition, should have these restrictions apply. And we know that can't be. Right? So now you're going to have to make one final move. All right? But anyway, but I want to make sure everyone understands up to this point. Okay? Any questions up to this point before we make the final move? Right, at this point in time. Which basically, if you think about it, what has it done to Seudah Mafsekes? It's kind of like pushed it to the side and said, no, we don't care about Seudah Mafsekes. At this point, if you walked away from the Gemara at this point, you would say, okay, well, since it's a Zman Shel Avelis, so then anything I have to, my achila from that point on, it's going to be expressed. The restrictions are going to be expressed in the achila, right? Because it's din in the Zman. So I don't care which Seudah I have. It would be irrelevant. There's no Seudah Mafsek Ba. It's Seudah per se that's the problem. Because anytime I have a Seudah, the restrictions must be Chal. Okay? But we know that's not true. So how does the Gemara escape? So just factually, what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says, no. The Gemara says, Kamash Malan, B'Seudah HaMafsek Ba. So this, I think this answer now is telling you how these two principles really work together. What's that answer telling you? Now, and don't say, if someone says, oh, it's only by the Suda, you have to answer, what do you mean? It's just restricted to the Suda Mafsekes? Why should it be restricted to the Suda Mafsekes? No, in other words, we're trying to resolve how these two principles work together. One principle is that my last meal on Erev Tisha B'Av, right, I should have only one tavshil, right? And another restriction is that, another principle is that the zman of the restriction of having one tavshil starts from chatzos. Okay, from 6 hours and beyond, that's when that time starts. Okay, and what the Gemara is trying to figure out is how those two things work together. So up to this point, the point we're at right now, the Gemara is saying that if you want to create a Zman Shel Avelos, right, which is created, it's saying from 12 p.m. until 6 p.m., during that period of time, right, you're in a more, like in a sadder state, right? And because you're in a sadder state, what that would necessarily, you have to conclude from that, is that every time you have a Suda, you must limit yourself to one tavshil. But we know that's not true, right? Because we know the other principle. So how does that other? What is the Gemara says? No, Suda Mafsekes. What's it really saying? What's it really saying? But it's only why? But 1 second. What do you mean? Why should only be one Suda? If I eat 5 Sudas after Chatzos, 4 of them I can eat whatever I want, and the 5th one I have to have the restriction because it's Mafsekes. Why? What's the formulation? That's what I want to know. What are Chazal really telling us now? They're formulating this. They're showing you in the formulation it's not what you thought. Who's up? Go ahead. Be clear. It's not that we're not taking the Suda Mafsekes and then like redefining its DNA. You understand? That's not what Chazal are doing here. Because if that were the case, then I could keep saying, before Chatzos, I can have a Suda Mafsekes, and no one would tell me I'm a bad Jew for having my Suda Mafsekes for Chatzos. Okay? And insofar as the Suda Mafsekes is concerned, right? That is a Suda HaMafsek. You can't twist that any other way. That is a Suda Mafsek. What's the Gemara telling you here? So I think the move is like this. I think the final step you have to take is like this. In other words, I still want to stick with my idea that a Suda Mafsek is always a Suda Mafsek no matter when I have it. Okay, I could have it 7 years before Tisha B'Av, so to speak. As long as my das is that this is my last meal, it's a Suda Mafsek. That's what it means. The Suda Mafsek, right? But the problem the Gemara got itself into at this point is it's saying that, but at the same time, the Gemara thought we have a Zman Shel Avelos, right? From 6 hours and beyond. But if it's an idea in a Zman, right, then the problem is any Suda I have would require to have those restrictions, right? So what's the Gemara saying? So the Gemara can't abandon the notion of a Zman. That it can't do. Because 6 hours and beyond, there's something going on there. So it can't abandon it. Right, but it can't stick to it in a literal way, because if it does, then every time I have a Suda, it's going to have restrictions, right? So what's the Gemara going to have to say then? And I think I forgot who was saying this. Someone was saying this before. And this was bothering some of the guys before, which is that in other words, I think people were bothered by the fact of, well, there's something like not right about having your Suda Mafsekes without the restrictions, right? I mean, I think there was a sense of that before. Like, well, what do you mean? How can it be a Suda Mafsekes if you don't have these restrictions, right? Am I correct in making that assessment that there was a kind of like a murmur to say that there's something like wrong about that? The
restrictions of the 6 hours you're not equal to the.
Well, hold on. So I think the answer is like this. I think it's a simple answer. It's a simple halachic answer. In other words, I think what it's saying is that it's not that the Zman Avelos, right, produces the restrictions, right? Because if that were the case, then anytime I eat, it'll be a problem. No, it's that what they said was like this. They said there's an idea of Suda Mafsekes, okay? But they want to say that there's a kiyum in having an expression of avelos in your Suda Mafsekes. And that can only take place from Chatzos and beyond. Okay? It's not that you don't have a Suda Mafsekes if you eat before Chatzos. It's a Suda Mafsek. But they want to say there's a kiyum to have an expression of avelos in your Suda Mafsekes. Okay, and that can only take place during the Zman of Avelos, which starts at 12 p.m. from Chatzos and beyond. Okay, that's how the Gemara unites the principles. Okay? I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, for sure. I'll give you. I'll prove to you why that's the case. I'll prove it to you. Okay? Because if you see the Rambam says, right? He says in Halacha Tes, he says Zohi midas kolam, right? She'ein echol lisbol yoser midar. He says Ava Chasidim Rishonim kachai samidasan erev Tisha B'av hayu mevin lo la'adam levado. Right? So they would bring on erev Tisha B'av. They bring to a guy by himself pas chareva melach v'shor b'mayim, like basically like crusty bread and salt and like a little bit of water. The Yoshev being taner v'kirayim, he'd sit between the ovens, right? The ochla v'shosa alea kiton shamayim b'da'aga v'shamon v'chia kimisha meso mutolafanav. Okay, so the Rambam says that the Chasidim Rishonim, what would they do? So you see, they wouldn't just have the restriction limited to tafshil, because what does taking away a tafshil do? I mean, this is more for next week, but taking away tafshil takes a certain chashivas in the Suda, right? It's not as enjoyable, it's not as important and enjoyable of a meal if I only have one tafshil. The Rambam goes further. The Rambam says that's not enough. The Chasidim Rishonim, what would they do? They would have other positive expressions of avelis in their Suda Mafsekes, meaning it's a Suda Mafsek with a kiyum of avelis. And they went further than simply restriction of one tafshil. They went as far as to say that, and by the way, the Shulchan Aruch brings down halacha l'maisa. Says you should sit on the floor. You shouldn't have a zimun, right? You shouldn't. In other words, you should avoid having like a normative happy suda, because that's all the kiyum in the avelis. But my point is that it's not that they restructured the suda mafsek ba. It's always a suda mafsek ba. They just said that there's a kiyum to have a suda mafsek ba that has an expression of avelis. So that's why Amros Bavel it's not just Amros Bavel. You see that when you eat the Suda Mafsekes, it's not supposed to be eaten together with your family and like as a joyous thing. On Erev Tisha B'av, a guy should sit in the corner by himself, right? He should be on the floor. He should be like an Avel. That's a kiyum in the Suda Mafsekes, because he's expressing Avelis in his Suda Mafsekba. But it's not changing the Suda Mafsekba. The Suda Mafsekba is always Suda Mafsekba. The kiyum Avelis just emerges from this period of time that Chazal set up. Right, that this is a more serious time, but it's not that the Suda Mafsekes itself is being altered. It's always a Suda Mafsekba. So if I had a Suda Mafsekba before Chatzos, I had a Suda Mafsekba, but I lacked the kiyum of Avelis. I lacked that expression of Avelis that should take place in Erev Tisha B'av. You know what I mean? That's what I think the approach is. I don't know about that, but I think that's the idea. Yes. People today, what do? They have like a big lunch, and then they have like a little thing before Tisha B'av. But that doesn't seem to be. You'll see halacha l'maisa. It's not really the case. That's what happened. You'll see. I mean, the idea of having eggs actually cited by the Rush, and it goes back many years. But he would say that when you have an egg, he would argue that it's in the Suda Mafsek itself. Like part of Suda was having an egg. You know what I mean? But we'll get to that. That's more insofar as Yeah, right. We go from again. Let's say the Ashkenaz. We go from 3 weeks, right, where there's like Yud Beis. That's like sphere of restrictions, and we slowly kind of like get more and more engaged in the Avelis, right? So Chazal want to say that the period of time right before Tisha B'av itself also has to have a certain seriousness to it, right? But the thing is like this. The question is, how do they have it expressed? So if it's just a din in the Zman, right? So then. But again, the Gemara is saying that Suda Mafsek is always a principle. So they could have said that any time you eat during Nizman, it has to have restrictions. But they didn't want to do that. They wanted it to be. I can't answer why they didn't want to do that. I can just tell you that logically speaking, they're saying that in the two possible formulations, one formulation is the Zman itself. But the Gemara says, but then what's Suda Mafsek? No. So they wanted the idea of the Avelis to be expressed through the Suda Mafsek. But they weren't going to change the Suda Mafsek. Suda Mafsek is always a Suda Mafsek. And therefore, a guy would just be lacking a kiyum if he had it before Chatzos. I mean, the Rambam himself says if a guy had it before Chatzos, he doesn't say it's not a Suda Mafsek. It's still a Suda Mafsek. But it would be lacking that kiyum Avelis. That's what I'm trying to say. Is that clear or no? I can't answer. If you want to ask the question, well, why 6 hours? Why not 12 hours? I have no idea. Who knows? I mean, whatever. I mean, that's just a din in siruf. I mean, we can speculate up to Kingdom Come why 6 hours versus whatever else. Point is that what? We set up the question next week, so we can jump right back into it. Okay. Let's just real quickly, let's do the next Gemara. So the Gemara says, so just skip a little bit, the Gemara then says that Tanya Kalishna Kama Erev Tisha B'Av Lo Yochel Adam Shnei Tavshilin Lo Yochel Basar Lo Yishteh Yain. Okay? So the original way to learn the Gemara, the one shita holds, and it's based in the Mishnah. One shita holds, right, that a person has to have restricted eating on Erev Tisha B'Av. So you can't have 2 cooked dishes. We're not ready to answer what that is yet, but you can't have 2 cooked dishes. You can't have meat, and you can't have 1. Okay? And then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel comes along and says, Yeshana, right? So what does he say? Guy has to make a change. Now, what does that mean? So now, another Amar comes along. Amar Yehuda, Ketzad Mishana. So what do you do to make a change? So if a guy normally has 2 cooked dishes, he should only have 1. If a guy normally has with a meal with 10 people, have it with 5. Okay? So again, he's also endorsing this idea, which is that when it comes to your Seudas Mafsekes, right, all these restrictions only apply when the kiyum avelis can emerge. But Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rav Yehuda have a completely different idea because the original way of learning is to say one sheet is going to say that there's certain objective considerations, right? There's shnei tavshilin, basar and yain, right? He comes along and says, no, guy, he's subjective, does whatever he wants. As long as he's mishana and he changes, like he lessens what he normally does, that's considered a fulfillment, a kiyum in the avelis, okay? But the question is, what's the machlokas? And Rav Shimon ben Gamliel seems very strange. I mean, since when? This is the question you need to think about. Since when do we give it to people? Chazal don't like doing these kind of things, like giving people the means of on their own determining shear. In other words, the fact is, we like objective shear, and we like to say what you're not allowed to have A, B, and C. You can't have 2 tafshilin. You can't have. But let's say I'm a guy. Let's say I have 50 cups of wine a day, so I only have 49. That's my kiyum avelis. What kind of thing is that? And you're going to put it in people's hands and allow them on a subjective level to determine how much they should have? That's crazy. So you have to define. The next step is to define that machlokas, okay, which is an important one to understand, and then go further on and start preparing the idea of the machlokas between the Rishonim about what shnei tavshilin is. Okay. Chefzagavra, right? Chefzagavra. Well, you should spend even more time on it.